The order of proceedings is simple. We have 4 distinguished speakers. Their accomplishments are many and their expertise is acknowledged. I will not recount those as I introduce them because the detailed biographies are available in the program and on the website. Each of our 4 speakers will take their moment at the podium, but we intend to leave ample time for questions and discussion after their presentation. So note down your thoughts, your questions and your comments over the course of the 4 presentations and join in the discussion towards the end. Our first speaker is Ari Hoffman. He is an Australian Laureate Fellow and based at the Centre for Environmental Stress and Adaptation Research here at the University of Melbourne. Thank you, Ari.
Thank you. One of the exciting environments that I work in is the Victorian Alps, and it's one of those areas where you really get a sense of wilderness. And I think this sort of photo captures it quite nicely. You look out at the vista and all you can really see is natural environment. And when you see that natural environment, it immediately, or at least in my case, it immediately makes me feel relaxed and makes me feel at one with something, but I'm not quite sure what it is. So these Alps, of course, are part of our national park. In fact, it's one of the largest national parks in Australia. It covers several 100,000 hectares, and it's what we like to call reasonably intact. So there isn't too much evidence of human invasion into that particular region, except for the snowfields, of course. Now, it has been used by humans on and off for probably hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. And of course, this particular picture is of an area called the Bogon High Plains, and the Bogon High Plains are actually named after a moth, the Bogon moth, which was a very important food source for some Aboriginal clans. It's very rich in protein. I haven't actually tried it, but I'm told that it's quite crunchy and quite sweet if you actually taste it. So more recently, we have had some European involvement in the Alps in terms of trying to extract something from it. And in some ways, the Victorian Alps and also the New South Wales Alps have become part of our Australian identity. Obviously, that's captured by poems like The Man from Snowy River, and of course we also had the film and the TV series based on that. And it's around this idea that you have this sort of rugged existence, if you like, where people cobble together these primitive huts, and they live in those during the summertime, and they camp out and look after stock up in the Alps that are grazing in those areas that are available to fatten up cattle in particular. So we've had this sort of very strong identity connected to the Alps. And, you know, when you go up there and you look at these huts, I mean, you cannot but be impressed by them. They really look like pioneering enterprises. They are clearly makeshift constructions, although they've obviously lasted for quite a long time. And you can almost imagine living in them for a period and sort of feeling at one with nature. And in fact, you can actually do a tour, which is very popular with tourists, of these huts by following a particular path. So that's an example on the Bogon High Plains on the right-hand side there of one of these paths that you can follow, and it's very popular with tourists. And it gives us a chance to connect to that sort of pioneering spirit, if you like. Now, of course, this was really not so much a romanticized notion of the landscape, but an attempt to use the landscape for agricultural purposes. And you've no doubt seen in the news that we have had a situation where a very long conservation battle was fought for about 40 years to try and get cattle out of the high country. And then one of the first things that happened when we had a change of government recently is that cattle were allowed, at least on a pseudo-scientific basis, to enter the high country again. And clearly there was a lot of press around that. And I think people didn't quite appreciate that there was actually a 40-year battle fought to get the cattle out of the high country. So here we have a couple of pictures of cattle back in the high country in the last season. And one of the challenges, of course, is that there can be damage done by cattle, as you can see down the bottom there from photos that were taken in the area where the cattle were present. So basically, the problem is that cattle can look pretty amongst grass, but they can turn these alpine bogs into muddy puddles, as you can see down the bottom there. And that process, unfortunately, can happen quite quickly. And of course, that's of concern to us because there are many plants and animals that live in those vegetated areas that are actually quite threatened. There's quite a lot of biodiversity that's very unique to those areas. And that includes plants like trigger plants on the left-hand side there, very pretty Australian native plants. It also includes many insects. As you can see in the middle there's a couple of specimens that are quite unique to the alpine area. And it also includes vertebrates, such as the alpine mountain pygmy possum on the far right corner there, and also certain types of frogs as well in that particular region. So we have quite a lot of biodiversity that potentially is threatened by those sorts of processes. And of course, that was one of the arguments that were used to actually get the cattle out of the national park in the first place. So whether it was the right thing to do is not really what I'm concerned with here. It's just something to think about because it really does lead to a clash of what we think the alpine region should look like. You know, should it reflect our pioneers or should it reflect an area where biodiversity is actually protected? And of course, you could go up there and never see these rare animals or even some of these rare plants that are found in that region. So what does biodiversity actually mean to you if you actually don't encounter it as you're stumbling along, unless you're an absolute fanatic and really know your vegetation? Now, the other challenge we have when we think about landscapes is that they are not constant. They are changing all the time. So that first picture showed you this massive extensive landscape that was largely untainted by human invasion. But of course, there are changes in that landscape that are happening all the time. And they are with us as we speak. So here's an example of a picture that I often put up when I talk to alpine management people to try and illustrate some of these processes. And there are really four main processes that are happening in this particular picture. So this again is a wilderness area. It's really has never been settled, has actually never been grazed, but yet there are major changes happening in this particular landscape. Now the obvious one is fire, and you can see that the eucalyptus down in the foreground there have been burnt. This is basically a close-up of that previous photo. And that fire, of course, went through. We had a fire in 2003, we had one in 2008 that caused an awful lot of damage. Now, that fire has led to a lot of debates about cattle and whether cattle can suppress fire, and that's largely accepted that that's probably not the case, except in very special circumstances. But it's nevertheless a debate that is raised and has probably not been settled yet, at least as far as the current government's concerned. So fire is an obvious thing, but it's not the only thing, because the other thing we have, of course, is droughts. So because of climate change coming along, we not only expect to see a higher incidence in fire, but we also expect to see a lot more droughts. And of course in Victoria, we have come out of a 10-year drought situation, which almost led to our water supplies running out. We're all very aware of that as the public, even in an urban setting. But this drought also had a major impact on a lot of plants. So here's an example of a very common grass species up in the Alps that's died as a consequence of that recent drought. And on top of that, we also have a situation where what's happening at the moment is that we have a vast number of propagules of all types of animals and plants buzzing around the globe. We have invasions happening because we are spreading species so quickly. And what's happening in the alpine areas, we have a threatening process associated with weeds in particular, and also with some animals that are really starting to potentially lead to changes in that landscape. So that sort of brown stuff you see there is actually an invasive weedy species. So you've got an environment that is pretty much unaffected by humans that is actually suffering from a weedy invasion that is an indirect consequence of humans at least being present in the vicinity of that particular landscape. So some of these effects that we're having can be quite direct, as in cattle grazing, but many of the effects and many of the challenges we face, at least in preserving this biodiversity, are related to these much more indirect effects of humans. And I think that's a real challenge, because this landscape is not going to remain static, it's going to change. All right, so as city dwellers, why do we care? Why do we care? Why is this important to us? Why do we have to worry about it? Well, one of the reasons why we worry about it is because the Alps are a very vast region, and they act a bit like a sponge. When you go up into the Alps and you bounce up and down on the vegetation, you're often bouncing up and down on a very large peat layer that actually traps a huge amount of water. And that water, of course, is responsible for a lot of our water supply that we use for irrigation and all sorts of other reasons. So obviously on the right-hand side at the bottom there, we have a picture of what's not a natural landscape. But that natural landscape does depend on that natural landscape, because of course those sorts of landscapes that you might have in your backyard, well, hopefully not that big, but at least it might be present in your backyard in a small way, depends on water. And that water might be stored in one of our reservoirs that we find around Melbourne. That's actually a picture of Lake Eildon, which of course is very important from an agricultural production as well as a recreational point of view. If you don't have water, you can't grow your crops. So once we start losing that sponge, then we could be in trouble, because we are simply not able to capture that much water. So we've got a situation where we are indirectly changing landscapes, and we are also indirectly cutting off part of our life support system. And these things we call ecosystem services that are provided by the landscape, and are not really appreciated to much of an extent in the wider public arena at this stage. But it's certainly something that we need to be concerned about in the long run. So despite the fact that we have these threatening processes, there is a certain amount of resilience in the landscape. And this is actually a picture of part of that Bogon High Plains that was severely degraded by cattle in this particular century. And if I took a picture of this particular area back in the 80s, I would see a paddock that was grazed down. Now what you can see now is what's happened very quickly is that we've had a lot of our wildflowers bouncing back to produce this beautiful area, which is very high in biodiversity. So there is certainly a certain amount of resilience in the landscape, even though it's also quite easy to wreck. So don't get the sense that it's very fragile, because it can to some extent bounce back. And I think as ecologists, we have this challenge, if you like, to try and work out how much these landscapes can bounce back before they actually fall over. So this hopefully, this very short talk has hopefully raised a few issues that we may deal with as part of this discussion, and hopefully we'll get a few questions and a bit of discussion around this sort of thing. What should our landscape look like? What is worth protecting? And this is quite a nice example of the sort of issues that people have to deal with every day. So here we have some horses in the landscape, and of course horses are a bit like cattle. They are big, heavy animals, and this landscape hasn't seen those sorts of heavy animals for several million years. So you start putting animals like this in the landscape, and horses can also lead to muddy puddles and also affect our biodiversity. So they are also, if you like, a threatening process. But of course, a lot of our Australian culture is tied up with the notion of the horse in the wild landscape, the Brumby notion, and that is very important to people. People like to see this picture. They get excited about seeing horses roaming around in a wild environment like the Alpine National Park. And in fact, at the moment, there is a request to list these wild horses as a species that's worth protecting and developing a strategy for to actually protect in the long run. So where do you put them? What do you do with them? What do you do when they become a threatening process? At what stage do you preserve these horses in the wild as opposed to worrying about the landscape? Or should you lock it up and basically make sure that nothing is actually intruding on that particular landscape? Those are the sorts of issues we're grappling with, and that's where I'll leave it. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks very much, Ari. And our next speaker, Janine Burke, is based at Monash University and has written many books on Australian art, and amongst them her latest are called Source, the Healing Power of Nature in Art. Thanks, Janine.
Hello, everyone. What is a landscape? What is art? There are no such words in Aboriginal languages. Yet what is called Aboriginal art is fundamentally a representation of landscape. And landscape is identity for Aboriginal people. In some modern societies, art can exist separately from its environment. For traditional Aboriginal art, there is no separate, there is only environment. Aboriginal art is also the most popular, commercially successful and internationally regarded aspect of Australian art, and the best known and the most lauded of Aboriginal artists is Emily Kame-Ngware. In 1997, the year after Emily died, she was chosen as an Australian representative at the Venice Biennale, the world's most prestigious contemporary art survey. This is her painting, Al-Halkara, from 1996. Her huge, lush, abstract paintings have been compared to Claude Monet, the great Impressionist painter, and Jackson Pollock, whose drip painting method revolutionised the technique and the spatiality of modernism. Yet Emily knew nothing of Western art, had not attended art school, and was illiterate in the English language. As enigmatic as either Monet or Pollock, she rarely discussed her painting, except to say that she painted whole lot, that's the whole lot, a welye, my dreaming. Like Monet, her work profoundly homaged nature, and like Pollock, it was influenced by the ceremonial ritual of dance. Like that other great landscapist, Georgia O'Keeffe, Emily was a desert dweller whose soul was most comfortable in vast, dry spaces. But unlike those artists, Emily was the land's traditional caretaker and myth keeper. In a sense, Emily created herself as an artist, though her perception, most likely, was that the land had created her. Her story is extraordinary because it is true. Emily, as she signed her paintings and as she was known, was a tribal elder of the Anmachere language group. Her traditional lands are in the Central Desert, an area known as Utopia, about 250 kilometres northeast of Alice Springs. In 2007, in the month before the intervention, I visited several remote communities in Utopia where Emily lived and painted. The first was Mulgabor, Akaya. And in this photograph you can see just over here Lindsay Bird Empachane, who after his mother died, Emily brought up, mothered him, and two of Emily's daughters, Jessie and Rosie Bird. This was the first place that I visited. And the second was Rocket Range, Unkawera. All of the communities were, by edict of the people, alcohol-free. Emily was born around 1910. The date is inexact because Aboriginal births were not recorded until the 1960s. Much of her life is a mystery, though it is inextricably tied to the occupation of Aboriginal land by European colonisers. In 1976, Aboriginal land rights were made law in the Northern Territory. 3 years later, Emily's people gained the freehold title of Utopia, and once more the land was truly theirs. At the same time, Emily began making bold, brilliantly coloured silk batik prints. In 1988, when she started painting, she won immediate critical acclaim, and over the next 8 years produced over 3,000 artworks, a feat worthy of Picasso. This is Emu Woman from 1988. It's Emily's first painting. It was greeted with delight and astonishment. As one critic noted right from the start, the brighter spotlight was trained on Emily Ngware and has remained there ever since. For Emily, creativity is a place. The flowering of her artistry is historically linked to retrieving, in legal terms, the original source of her inspiration and identity, her genius loci. Possessing her territory and knowing it was safely back in Aboriginal hands perhaps helped to trigger the freedom and the confidence, after she had access to Western art materials, to splendidly tell her country's story. Emily painted her canvases on the earth, a literal and symbolic act of recovering it. What had been taken was returned. What she had lost was regained. The journey she'd made over her lifetime was as complete as a circle, the circle or dots that signify her dreaming in its detail and its wholeness. As Robin Davidson writes, scholars are still trying to describe the dreaming in such a way as to make it accessible to non-Aboriginal understanding. At the time of creation, great ancestral beings moved across the land. Their journeys and actions are inscribed on the landscape, concentrated in sacred sites such as rock formations, rivers, trees and waterholes. To Aboriginal people, the whole land is full of signs, used and read, as clearly as if it were bristling with notice boards. Dreaming can also be translated less romantically as law, because the mythic being gave specific moral and social structures to the people. Law also applies to the production of paintings, whose procedural and technical aspects are not incidental, but the result of rules that are regulatory, binding and disciplinary. Each individual inherits the law and through ceremony reenacts it. It was because Emily boldly reinterpreted the visual precept she was taught that she became a highly regarded artist. In 2008, Canberra's National Museum hosted her retrospective that also attracted record crowds in Tokyo. Walking through the galleries, I observed the reverence, pleasure and awe with which people contemplated her paintings. Yet only a handful would know Emily's country or her dreaming. Emily was not trained as an artist in the Western sense, but trained for decades in the minute observation of nature, in her dreaming stories, and in the complex visual representations, the patterns that encode and explain that mythology. Kame, her given name, is the seed of the pencil yam or bush potato, a perfect name for an artist. It provides an image of latent, natural fecundity. Emily adopted her Western name later. As the guardian of the pencil yam seed, Emily, by performing rituals associated with it, was maintaining the renewal of a key food source and the balance of nature, a sacred cycle managed by her people for centuries. To Aboriginal people, the land is a child, nurtured by seasonal ceremony. While the patterns in men's artwork derive from their ceremonies involving sand paintings, women's designs in the Central Desert come directly from the body in a female-only dreaming called a welye. Emu Woman shows the intricate dot and line patterns in brown, black, yellow and white that decorate the body in these ceremonies. Despite the painting's abstraction, the form of a woman's body is clearly discernible. While the men hunted the emu with spears, the women followed its tracks with digging sticks, searching for plants that could be used for food and medicine. Aboriginal society is highly segregated and few tasks are shared by men and women. Penny Tweedy's photograph from 1982 shows Emily being painted up at a welye at Utopia Station. Surrounded by other women, Emily's shoulders, breasts and upper arms are being decorated with designs in ochre. Pleasure in the body, in a sisterhood of touch, is also part of a welye. Emily, who is singing, looks diminutive, but her thickly veined hands and forearms are massive for a woman. Her face, with prominent nose and full lips, is majestically lined. For Anmachere people, the pendulous breasts of an older woman are magical tactile surfaces on which the dreaming is inscribed, not sites of shame or embarrassment. Emily did it tough. After she married, she and her husband worked on cattle stations. Domestic service was the usual occupation for Aboriginal girls, not Emily. She worked outside like a man. She didn't earn money, Aboriginal women weren't paid wages, but rations of tea, flour, jam and bullock meat and portions of plug tobacco. Later she married again, and when that husband died, Emily returned to Utopia. Carr from 1991 can be read variously and simultaneously as a map of the earth and the stars, the underground plants and the animal tracks, the mythic ancestors' journeys and the hunting paths of her own people, the cosmos and her country. Time and space are compressed into a thoroughly readable image of the universe. The work explains, better than words, the dreaming's holistic philosophy as a net that captures and sustains everything, and where everything is alive. The dreaming is represented as a perfect, luminous entirety, shining with health and optimism, stretching out forever. The shimmering web of the dreaming that Emily illustrates shows no rupture, no crude or ugly passages, no marks of sadness or mourning, no lack. But equally, Emily's paintings offer no place for a clash of cultures, for our seemingly insoluble, intertwined problems. Emily's political statement is her dreaming, transcendence, unity, eternity, an ideal community, utopia. The resilience of Aboriginal people to survive and thrive for thousands of years in such a demanding climate, sustained by their law, has made them the colonisers' relentless adversary and occasionally victor. Contemporary Aboriginal art itself is a triumph, proving Aboriginal people are enterprising, talented, flexible, inquisitive, and able to adopt new materials and find fresh expression for their culture. In mid-August of 1996, at Alpara, under a big old eucalypt, 2 weeks before she died, Emily painted a series of 24 small canvases. We're back to Alhalkara again. These flamboyantly handled and lusciously hued works, some in startling fluorescent colours, others in luminous skin tones of umber and cream, mark the zenith of her career, rivalling in their supreme mastery of the medium Monet's late water lilies and Pollock's strip paintings. In 1996, Emily was old and frail. She had arthritis, moved with difficulty and needed a walking stick. Monet too had arthritis in his later years. Monet's and Emily's last paintings are brilliantly orchestrated farewells, works of genius that equal the source of their inspiration, their chosen landscapes, the landscapes of their identity. Reflecting on Emily's last series, Michael Ether wonders, what were Ngware's intentions with these final, baffling, sublime works? Perhaps she was reacting to the irony of it all, sparse conditions, yet an unimaginably rich cultural heritage. Perhaps a sly joke, a criticism of our white consumer reliance on her providence, the vulgarity of it all. We will never really know. This was the last and perhaps most startling place I visited on my journey through Utopia. It's Emily's grave. Surrounded by native grasses and graceful ghost gums, there's nothing else in sight. No houses, no people, no fences, no road. It was Emily's last camp. She did not die here, but in Alice Springs. Can you read that clearly? Emily Kame Ngware died September 2, 1996, a great Australian artist. The gravestone is a well-meaning though incongruous tribute representing the differing expectations, the contradictory results, the unpredictable and often startling intersections of our black-white, non-Indigenous relations. Emily's oeuvre can be read as an historical document about colonisation, as a myth about dreamtime creatures, a detailed map of the country, complete with information about plants, animals and water supplies, a sensual feminine tracery describing the curves of a woman's body, a cosmic diagram, the victory of nature and imagination over deprivation and loss, and also about the land rights struggle of Indigenous people, the survival of Aboriginal culture. Finally, Emily's work is a complex and triumphant journey home to her place of creation, a place which she has taught us to cherish. Thank you.
Thank you, Janine. Our next speaker, Tim Bonnie Hattie, is based at the Australian National University in Canberra, where he's the Director of the Australian Centre for Environmental Law and the Centre for Climate Law and Policy. Thanks, Tim.
How do I change the top one here? You can go that way, or you can use this one and press the one here. That one? Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you particularly to Patrick for inviting me. Although I run the two centres at the ANU in the law school, I've spent a lot of time writing about Australian landscape painting, particularly colonial landscape painting, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. The nexus, or at least the alleged nexus, between Australian landscape painting and Australian national identity goes way back. Already in 1872, an essayist on the fine arts in Victoria argued that the artist Louis Bouvelot, who had arrived in Australia from Switzerland in 1865, was, quote, first to reveal the special picturesqueness and wonderful variety of form and colour presented by the commonly despised trees of Australia, and to show that whether in isolation or in combination, these ragged and rugged members of the eucalyptus family are no less beautiful than the more symmetrical and umbrageous elm, oak, beech and birch of the mother country. A year later, Melbourne's preeminent art critic James Smith was applauding Bouvelot for showing how, and again I quote, how undeserving our indigenous vegetation is of the disesteem into which it has fallen in the estimation of those whose eyes have been formed or disciplined by long familiarity with the more symmetrical, compact, leafy and well-balanced trees of Great Britain. Bouvelot, by these accounts, was an artist who helped his fellow colonists to appreciate their new environment and, in doing so, helped them to begin to feel Australian. That was in an era when Bouvelot's paintings were sometimes reproduced through engravings in illustrated newspapers, as well as just once as a chromolithograph and perhaps occasionally in photographs. But on the whole, Bouvelot's work was seen only in the original. While three of his paintings were soon acquired by the National Gallery of Victoria, and you can see one of them on the screen at the moment, his work was otherwise seen only in contemporary exhibitions, which typically lasted just for a few weeks. That meant that the opportunities for Bouvelot's work to change how colonists related to the landscape were actually very limited. Those who saw the charm of the gum trees after, quote, looking at them through the artist's eyes, as James Smith put it in 1888 when Bouvelot died, were probably few. There's another of his pictures. Since then, the world of art has changed profoundly through what Walter Benjamin famously dubbed the age of mechanical reproduction. While Benjamin focused on the loss of the aura of original artworks through reproduction, what is important here, if we are to consider how landscape painting may have changed national identity, is how reproduction has brought particular pictures to a general audience. So what I want to do today, just briefly, is consider how one might go about exploring this process, which I think typically involves focusing not on reproduction in books along the domain of catalogues of pictures, which I once was, but reproduction in other media, including cards and posters and even table mats and coasters, which bring particular images into people's daily lives. It is through these largely ephemeral and, as we'll see, not always very beautiful objects, disregarded other than on eBay, which is partly where I collect them, that I think we should pursue national identity. And I'll give just two examples, both of artists like Bouvelot celebrated for their renderings of gum trees with obvious potential implications for the national imagination. One is Hans Huyssen, especially this watercolour Summer, which won the Art Gallery of New South Wales' Wynne Prize for Landscape Painting in 1909 and was immediately bought by the Sydney Gallery. A decade later, Sid Ewell Smith's art in Australia reproduced summer in its special number, The Art of Hans Hyson, which was exactly what one would expect of a prize-winning painting in a major art museum. But then, much more interestingly, the Australian National Party Prime Minister, Stanley Bruce, reproduced summer on his 1927 Christmas card, and 3 years later, when Art in Australia published its first set of Christmas cards, intended above all to be sent overseas, summer was the most popular painting. Here, in those kinds of phenomenon, I suggest, is a kind of empirical evidence, all too rarely considered in this context, vital to any discussion of landscape painting and national identity. The other artist was Albert Namatjira, whose paintings were already available as prints from at least June 1950, when Clarkson's of Adelaide advertised the first Australian-produced print of Namatjira's Ghost Gum, which could be framed to suit the individual home decoration scheme. This clearly isn't that painting. 2 years later, Namatjira's pictures were turned into Christmas cards sold as six-packs for 9 shillings and 6p. Before long, they were being advertised extensively, not just in Alice Springs, but across the country, including in Tasmania and Western Australia, and sold extremely well because they were considered the most beautiful and exciting Christmas cards ever printed in Australia, essentially Australian. Here we have a Ghost Gum. As with the Hyson cards 20 years before, these Namatjira cards were produced with an international audience primarily in mind. The Sydney Morning Herald considered them typically Australian cards you'll be proud to send abroad. But they soon also found a big local market, so that when Namatjira was chosen as one of just 2 Northern Territorians to meet the Queen when she visited in 1954, Queen Elizabeth, on her first tour, he was identified as the artist whose watercolours of the inland appeared on Christmas cards, received in almost every Australian home this season. A decade later, they were available in other forms. In a Christmas gifts feature in December 1962, the Australian Women's Weekly reported that David Jones in Sydney was selling sets of 6 placemats featuring Australian scenery painted by Namatjira for £6.15 shillings. I think that was quite dear. 3 years later, he reported that a Brisbane woodcarver, Frank O'Brien, who ran 2 gift shops as well as his own factory, also was doing a line in... we'll get there. In table mats faced with Namatjira prints, which were in great demand as wedding presents. Coasters were also in production, as was a tray, though it was after a painting by Albert's son Keith. So, if you wanted, you could fit out your walls and, above all, your dining room with Namatjiras. So this is a typical framed print. They came in all kinds of sizes, from quite small to much larger, and they often came in these kind of period white frames, and you can often find them in antique shops and on eBay. Here, not very beautiful, is one version of the of Namatjira placemats, and these are Namatjira coasters. These coasters also came in a kind of plasticated, interesting form. The families who chose this decor were very various. Hetty Perkins, daughter of Charlie, the curator of Aboriginal art at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, has written of her Canberra childhood. We had Albert Namatjira placemats and those funny little Piccaninny drawings because it was about trying to reinforce a good representation. The renowned Australian critic Megan Morris has recalled of her very different childhood in Newcastle, at the family home at a print of Namatjira's Ghost Gum hanging near the wireless, and then, when her family acquired one, above the television. But Humphrey McQueen was surely right when he speculated that people who could not afford a Namatjira original bought table mats or other reproductions as a mark of support for Aboriginal advancement, uncertain though they were about its substance. And equally, I think one might speculate The people did so because of a new interest and attachment to the Central Australian landscape, which was coming to occupy an increasingly important place in national identity. Namatjira, I'm pretty sure, has occupied a bigger place in the Australian household than any other Australian artist. His work was also reproduced more than any other Australian artist in the mid-20th century, and it seems likely has been reproduced more than any other Australian landscape painter before or since. A better understanding of this embrace of Namatjira is, it seems to me, a good place to start if we are to pursue how landscape painting has shaped national identity. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, and I can't resist saying that I ate many a Sunday roast off Namatjira placemats as I grew up in the 1960s, and it's never occurred to me that that may have been the beginning of my career in art history. One can only speculate. Our final speaker, Rick Roush, is the Dean of the Melbourne School of Land and Environment. Thanks, Rick.
It's really a pleasure for me to be able to talk on the subject today. The Melbourne School of Land and Environment is very much committed to looking at resilience of the landscape, an issue that was first raised by Ari. But I've got lots of wonderful portraits and photos to show you.
Yeah, we found the day.
Great. So this is a project I worked on with a lot of ideas came from Nigel Stork, and I was also encouraged a lot by Patrick McKechnie, our director of the festival ideas, to pursue this and to really address cultivated land, its impact on Australian identity and biodiversity. And I think if you think back about the identity of Australia for a long time, it was really based on wealth made from the land. And oftentimes people would come here from Ireland or Britain, make their wealth here and return, and they often did it off the sheep's back. And in fact, historical records show that the grazing stocking rates that people used in the early days were clearly exploitive, that the stocking rates were often 10 times higher than they are today. So it was a matter of running a lot of sheep, getting a lot of wool, making a profit, and going home as the second or third son. But also dairies and cattle. We had lots of areas in New England that were cleared of trees that were just burned, not even logged, but just burned, so we could move things into dairy production. And in the north of Australia, famous families like the Droughts were involved in such activities. The grain production was a huge area early on, and even mining, especially with gold mining in Victoria and elsewhere. So a large part of the earliest Australian identity, and dare I say carried through to today, was really based on the wealth that one could make from the land, and that's clearly had a major impact on our ability to maintain biodiversity. So one could look at the cultivated land and Australian identity, and one perspective on this is the cultivated land could be seen as a haven, a sanctuary among the wildness of the bush, and might be represented in paintings. But another view that Nigel Stork and I found quite strongly represented in the literature was that really you were tearing out of the bush the capacity to actually start to generate wealth, and that the paintings, for example, would tend to celebrate this as an achievement in demonstrating the capacity to make wealth off the land. So just take a few look at these. So one of the quotes that impressed Nigel Stork and I as we looked into this came from a letter to the editor in 1889, which if you read through this, I just want to emphasize the last few lines. The axe will have laid the enemy low, and smiling pastures will have taken the place of heavy scrub. That we were taking that basically the bush was in the way of economic progress, and people who managed to clear it deserve to be lauded. And I think that really was a major part of Australian identity, at least in rural Australia, for a long time. So it's completely by accident. Tim and I feature the same portrait. We didn't collude in any way on this. We both happened on the same one, both in my case after wandering through the NGV. But I look at this and I see something very different than what Tim talked about. I look at this as illustrating that overgrazing by sheep property that I talked about earlier. So you could look at these things and you see some kind of a record of how things might have been done. Similarly, this is another broad property, and one might have expected that these areas would have been much more covered by sparse trees than is present here, and were cleared for grain production or sheep grazing, so on. And then you'd see cases like this that really celebrated taking an area that, that might have been represented by scrub throughout the area to start with, but was cleared to make this wonderful environment that could be featured in a painting, and celebrating the accomplishment of extracting something of great value out of land that was otherwise pretty worthless. And the next two portraits do the same thing, where you see that there's illustration of what the scrub continued to look like and how this area was cleared and turned into a very picturesque environment, the potential for generating wealth and really celebrating the accomplishment of having cleared this and turned it into something that would have been seen as useful. But I look at this painting, I want to draw your attention to something else about it. And that is, in this area, there's an uncleared patch, which is characterized by having rocks and so forth. And some people would look at that and say, it's the wildness of the bush or whatever. I look at it and say, gee, isn't it great they illustrated leaving biodiversity corridors in their land? So a different way of looking. But it's an area that they couldn't have cleared because it was too rocky. It couldn't have been developed. But it fits closely with my theme of, is cultivated land compatible with biodiversity? And across Australia it is, in the sense that there are these uncleared patches along the field margins and other areas that couldn't have been turned into anything useful from an economic standpoint, but are very valuable to us from preserving biodiversity, some of which Ari has already illustrated. Here's another one, Dunmore, in 1856, and again, you see the same thing, that there's cleared area, but along the edge, that the perspective of the artist stepped back far enough, I think, to sort of illustrate the cleared parts and what the economic return from that was, and had a patch for perspective perhaps in the front. He had to step back far enough to get the whole picture in, but he also illustrated what he saw. And I tend to look at that, it's rocky, it couldn't have been cleared, but it's exactly where the biodiversity would have been preserved. So if you think about threats to biodiversity, they include land clearing, feral pests and weeds, the sorts of things that Ari has illustrated earlier. And by feral pests, I also include diseases. And to a lesser extent, globally, poaching, either by killing animals for body parts, harvesting birds to ship for the international pet trade, or in some cases, poaching butterflies and some beetles for use in collections as well. It's interesting. By feral pests, I also include diseases, because in Australia, one of the most important feral introductions, and often unrecognized by anyone other than experts, is Phytophthora, a root disease that in many areas of Australia is killing trees and reducing areas that were wooded into basically areas of sedge land that can survive the Phytophthora attack. But these are the kinds of things that have a major impact, with land clearing, feral pests and weeds and so forth being among the dominant ones as a rule. So how is it that various countries, regions of the world have addressed biodiversity maintenance? And I've just chosen to highlight three. If you look at the United States, there was an early approaches to national park development in the 1830s, but the first national park anywhere in the world was proclaimed by President Ulysses S. Grant immediately after the Civil War. It was Yellowstone National Park. It's the world's largest volcanic caldera, and it still remains to be one of the best places in North America for maintenance of broad biodiversity. Not only, as I'll illustrate, preserving animals and plants and so forth, but also preserving a landscape that might otherwise be subject to exploitation by mining or whatever else. And it's important that as a contrast to Australia, that the national parks in the United States are absolutely sacrosanct. There is no grazing, no development, nothing can occur in them. The United States has a different strategy for allowing multiple use, and then it declares certain areas that are not quite as important for biodiversity or landscape management as national forests, and those are intended to be managed for multiple use, including logging and grazing and so forth. Australia, in contrast to the United States, the national parks really are the purview exclusively of the federal government. The states have a large role in managing them, which leads to the kinds of issues that Ari already identified. But the first one in Australia was founded in 1879. Because they were largely started in the states, there was much more state control. In Europe, there's a very contrasting approach, I think, because by the time people started thinking about national parks, lots of areas of Europe had been thoroughly cleared, colonized, established, and so forth, and it was too late. The lions and bears had all been chased out or killed and so forth. There wasn't, a lot of the kinds of biodiversity wasn't left. So Europe was relatively late on the scene with national parks. There are now 359. But in general, a major contrast between Europe and the United States and how they look at biodiversity is that subsidy payments, which has long been the bane of Australian farmers, subsidy payments in Europe are largely based on preserving environmental values, as opposed to the United States where they are designed to help preserve farmer livelihood. So there's a complete difference, a reversal, that in Europe they've put greater emphasis of late in using farming properties really to set aside and maintain biodiversity. Now, they're not a great way to maintain biodiversity because the very element of land clearing and tilling and so forth limits their potential, but there's still a focus, particularly as for habitats for birds and so forth, much more emphasis on biodiversity and linking subsidy payments to environmental values and farm properties that would be found elsewhere. So just to sort of contrast the way people look at this. And so in the United States, in Yellowstone, you'd have what we sometimes call charismatic megafauna, in this case, an American bison. So they preserve, the national parks are very effective for preserving monsters like this. This weigh about half a ton. You get the broad vistas that are well preserved against anybody exploiting things. This is Glacier National Park, which is on the Canadian border. The Grand Tetons. And all those kind of remind me a bit of the kinds of things that Australian landscape painters were doing in the case of von Gerard doing Mount Kosciuszko. And I think it's remarkable when you read about this experience that von Gerard had on Kosciuszko, where his group was really savaged by a storm, split up, went through a lot of trials and trepidations through while he was up there. And it didn't really seem to change the way he painted the landscape. He still had a very favorable view of painting the grandeur of it all, as might also be captured by the national parks in the United States. And then there's others like this, again capturing the grandeur. And when I saw this in the NGV, I was immediately reminded of a classic scene in Yellowstone where you can stand on one platform. This site's probably been photographed 5 million times, but you get a photo of Yellowstone Falls. It again, sort of the value of U.S. national parks were really set aside to capture the biodiversity as well as the grandeur of the landscape. So what I'll argue in the last few minutes is that cultivated land in Australia is compatible with Australian biodiversity, but we have to manage it well. We have to be careful. And Ari's already identified some of these kinds of issues. In the more cultivated areas, we really need to maintain the paddock margins as remnants and corridors for biodiversity, and that they're really valuable for this and have to be managed for that purpose. That is, it's thought that if you just have small patches of small organisms, plants, whatever, if they can't move around, they'll eventually tend to move toward extinction. They're unable to maintain any kind of level of genetic diversity, and often it's demographic effects, just the failure to find mates, especially if there's been a drought that causes a population to collapse locally. And if there's lots of small patches, they can all collapse. But if they're interconnected, there's a chance that some will survive and recolonize the others. So these corridors are really important. And as such, you can, even in cultivated land like extensive grazing pastures in Australia, you can encourage some biodiversity and wildlife use if you manage them properly. So this is an example of a photograph my daughter took for me earlier this month in the Adelaide Hills. It shows an example of cropping areas mixed within native trees. It sort of illustrates the kind of patchwork. If you get that sort of patchwork, you can certainly preserve smaller animals, such as this skink. Lots of plants and mushrooms and so forth can survive in these kinds of habitats, just by illustration. Some of the charismatic butterflies that we have, this being the wanderer butterfly. And with any luck, you can preserve some of our charismatic megafauna as well. So I want to thank the National Gallery for help with photos. Robin Krause-Hale helped me put on photos and also talked me out of a few things. And also the Art Gallery of South Australia provided one of the portrait photos as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all four of our speakers. Your precision in your presentations has given us ample time for questions, but the content of your presentations, I think, has thrown out some real challenges. I'll field the questions. We're like, speaking of charismatic fauna or pests, we're here like rabbits in spotlights, so it's quite hard to see. If you want to ask a question, by all means wave your hand. And just before you leap to your feet, I forgot to warn everyone that the proceedings are being filmed. So if you do anything silly while you're asking a question, it will, I understand the phrase is, go viral on YouTube. So, but there was a question there, and you can, we have wandering cordless microphones, so if you just pause before you ask your question so we can all hear it.
My name's Bronwyn Bain. I'm doing a PhD at Ballarat. And what it is for a non-Indigenous artist to experience the sacred in the land. I've been trying to get a copy of your book, Janine, and I can't. But what I wanted to point out is just something in the terminology of wilderness. And I've come across a few times from the Australian Aborigines, American Indians, and also from some people I spent time with in the Amazon, the Shuar Indians in Ecuador, is this concept of wilderness. And we talk about the wilderness and feeling at one with it, but they actually never saw it as wilderness. They always saw it as home. And it's wilderness brings up this concept of it's us against it, but in actual fact it is home. And if we saw it as home, we might look after it a bit better. Thank you.
Well, I mean, there's an implied question in there, I think, because the term, your questioner is right, the term wilderness sort of echoed through the presentations. I suppose in one level, question to the panel, is wilderness culturally specific in its usage, in your view? And is there anything characteristic about the way the word wilderness is used in Australia in discussions of environment?
Well, we don't tend to use the word wilderness either. I mean, we use the word bush. I think wilderness actually is probably from other cultures. And wilderness, I think, just using that word tends to imply a place that we as colonisers go into and explore. Whereas for Indigenous people, of course, they don't have to go in there and explore it because that is their heritage and that is their known and cherished place of identity.
From an ecological point of view, wilderness really means something that is not tainted by human activities to any great extent. Now, some people might argue that there's no such thing as wilderness because we effectively have tainted our landscape in some way everywhere, even in those areas that we think of as wilderness. But it's really those situations where you can try and conserve biodiversity and ecological and biological processes without the influence of human activities. So in that sense, I don't think it's an us and them. It's really a situation where you're sort of minimising that impact of human culture. That's quite the opposite to what you're talking about, where you see it as being home, which I think is really intriguing.
In the United States, the term wilderness has a semi-legal connotation that certain of these areas are actually designated as wildernesses. And in Alaska in particular, there's some large areas that are designated wilderness, and it has a legal protection context. But I think in the U.S., people would very often talk about themselves hiking out in the wilderness.
We have the same thing. We have a Wilderness Act in New South Wales. We have controversial wild rivers legislation in Queensland. We have heritage legislation where wilderness is a crucial category for the reasons which Ari gave. And I think what he said is really powerful. I mean, whether you want to use the term or don't want to use the term in a way for the kind of reasons you gave, the arguments for us to try and preserve a lot of those areas are really powerful.
I mean, I might just chip in and stop me if I'm completely ignorant, but there has been a significant shift, if you were to say that the word wilderness, in so to speak, a biblical sense, was a place of nothingness, indeed a place of temptation, whereas now we perhaps in popular parlance think of the wilderness as a place of purity, and there's been a dramatic shift there, but there is a question here in the centre, and the mic's on its way.
Karen Alexander, Victoria Naturally Alliance. It's an alliance of 10 environment groups that got formed to try and address biodiversity crisis in Victoria. Two parts to the question, and as an ex-Wilderness Society campaigner, the issue of wilderness is quite a contentious one with Indigenous people, quite understandably, because it has been used to lock them out. So that's a real political challenge to the use of the word. The two sections, they're a bit different. One is that the notion of our relationship and our sense of identity with landscape, and there's an awful lot of grey nomads out there, I think, having some identification of landscape in the outback, versus our relationship with biodiversity and the plants and the animals. There's a difference, I think, between those things, and I guess it came home to me really strongly in a fabulous trip I did to Mapuru, a little community in northeastern Arnhem Land, where, and anyone can go, I recommend anyone to go on this trip. It's going weaving with the ladies. They can't speak English, and of course we couldn't, of course, speak Yolngu. So your powers of observation, limited although I think ours sometimes are brought to focus. The big difference in my reflection on this was the strong relationship with species, because they're used for weaving and for eating and for ceremony and for a whole lot of things, versus our, and I'm generalising, stronger relationship with landscape, the Alps, the outback. So that's, that I'd like some comment on that.
Karen, I think we should probably aim... people have talked about if you want to conserve landscape, if you can use it in some way, and it doesn't have to be food, then that's probably a good way of protecting it. And that argument's been going around for quite a while now. So, for instance, if you're trying to protect animals that might be threatened, if you can use them as pets or promote them as pets, that might be one way of actually ensuring their long-term survival at the species level, which is what you're talking about. I wish, obviously there's been a move in Australia to start using bush foods, or at least recognising bush foods to a greater extent. So you can buy, a jam that might have a very small component of bush food in it, mostly sugar, of course. But at least it's a start in the right direction, and at least I think it says that if we are walking around our areas of wilderness, or whatever you want to call it, there are things out there that are food sources. There are things out there that can be appreciated in a different context than simply looking at them and not thinking about how they might be used. And I think that also provides a link to how that sort of area and that environment has provided food and other resources for the Aborigines and other animals. That's the wrong word. We appreciate also there are many animals out there that require these things for food. I think the Burgon moss is an excellent example of that, in fact, because it's actually used by humans, but it's also absolutely essential for supporting many types of marsupials. If it weren't there, for instance, we wouldn't have mountain pygmy possum, because, of course, they use Burgon moss to fatten up to survive the cold winter time.
Tim, you had some comment?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting observation, Karen. I think there's been quite a shift over time in terms of settler Australians. In my book, The Colonial Earth, I began the opening chapter with a sentence, "The invaders loved birds." And I wrote that partly because there was a famous line from Hancock about the invaders hated trees, and I wanted to kind of point out that there were actually many settlers who did find things in the landscape which they loved, and but when they did, it was species oriented, and for a long time birds were the ingredient of the landscape which they loved most. And I think there has been a kind of shift which you were talking about, away from species to attachment to landscapes.
Now, there was a question down towards the back. Yes, fantastic.
Ooh, stuck in my chair. This is a question probably for Rick and Ari. Rick, you mentioned, you explored the notion of biodiversity in cultivated landscapes, and they're mostly rural. And I'm just, given that we're all sitting here in Melbourne and greater populations are going to live in cities, and we're dynamic cities, and we're all looking to sort of reconnect with nature, is there a role for looking after and conserving biodiversity in urban areas?
Yeah, the answer is obviously, I think, very much yes. In fact, and also in peri-urban areas, there's some important grasslands that are sort of the last remnants of those particular types of grasslands on the Melbourne fringe that we ought to be concerned about. But there's lots of things you can do, and particularly, it appears, you'd probably think that the kinds of things we'd be preserving would include plants, fungi, lizards, frogs, insects, and all that can be done in urban areas. Probably for the insects, one of the most important things is making sure that we continue to cultivate plants and provide appropriate pollen sources.
I think there's a broader issue as well, in the sense that you can also use the nature of the urban area to promote the way people think about landscapes. So, for instance, if you try and create a European urban area, it looks very different to a native urban area. You know, if you go to places like Blackburn or Eltham, it looks very different to obviously Camberwell and Malvern and those sorts of suburbs. And I think, you know, it's almost like if you go to the more traditional suburbs, you don't really get a sense of what the environment in Australia is about. If you go to the Blackburns and the Elthams, you at least get some sort of sense about that. And at least then people can appreciate the sort of biodiversity that might be present in those environments. And I remember, you know, a couple of years ago, I was at a talk and someone said, oh gosh, you know, I live in Camberwell and it's really great because you can go out in the street and you can see rainbow lorikeets and there's a native species. Isn't it fantastic? And of course someone turned around and this particular panel said, well, that's a pest species in fact, and we'd love to get rid of it. And if you actually go to another area in Melbourne, you won't see that species because there are many other species that are filling an ecological niche that's available in that environment that's not available in Camberwell.
Now there's a question up the back there.
Peter Cuffey from Artists for Climate Action. I guess it's interesting when we talk about notions of wilderness. The irony is that Australia is one of the most urbanised populations in terms of demographic spread in the world. What then is the wilderness when nearly all of our human population is located along the littoral, along the coastal regional centres and cities of Australia? How do we interact with the interior, with the centre of this continent?
Perhaps, Tim, you address that, you began to address that. We address it on our dining tables, according to your...
the centre has occupied, if you're talking about settler Australians, the centre occupied a huge place in the kind of settler imagination, and people like Paul Carter have written pretty wonderfully about that, and Michael Cathcart has as well. In terms of visitation, there was just that, you know, profound shift which happened post-war when settler Australians begin visiting the centre in large numbers, and as part of that kind of shift, Alice Springs, which already had some kind of identity, gets significantly displaced by Ayers Rock come Uluru, and it's Uluru which becomes the centre of Australia, and that's something which I guess happens in the 1960s. It's post Namatjira. I mean, Namatjira is still in that period where it is Alice Springs and Hermannsburg and the Western McDonald's which are occupying the sort of Australian imaginary in which people are wanting to go to, and only a very small number of more pioneering Australians visiting the Rock. And then in the 60s, that really shifts. I mean, to go back, I mean, there's a kind of earlier period, going back to what I was talking about, where when Hans Huyssen does his sort of huge shift at the beginning of the 20s, and he goes out to the Flinders Ranges, where people think of the Flinders as being the centre of Australia. So the centre of Australia has been a movable feast.
I mean, one way to look at the kind of thing you're talking about, the fact that population is so concentrated in a few areas, in many ways that's probably a good thing for preserving biodiversity and habitat. And indeed, in the United States, areas that I used to hike at as a teenager now are very heavily restricted on a permit basis to try to keep people out. So you'd hike through Mount Whitney, tallest place in the continental United States, could sleep on top of it. You can't do that anymore. Famous national parks in the United States like Carlsbad, one of my high school friends eventually ended up on the national park staff based at Carlsbad Caverns. He told me that essentially what the park staff has decided is that the main Carlsbad Cavern that people travel through is basically sacrificed, that they know it's gradually being ruined. There's several other caverns apparently in the area that are known to the park staff that are being left sealed to protect them in the future, and they've basically said, we have to sacrifice one of them, it'll be the big cave. The other ones we're preserving by not letting anybody into them or know about them. So the fact that in some ways it's an asset for Australia that the population's concentrated in a small area and you limit the amount of traffic to them. And in places in the United States, as probably expansive it is, they're having to increasingly restrict traffic to serve the primary function of national parks as preservation.
But just to chase the questioner's thinking a little further, if I may, does that suggest then that the model of cohabitation is that the vast majority of us live on the coast and imagine a place in the centre which is our landscape, but never actually visit it, but perhaps following Tim's logic, imagine it through everything from Christmas cards through to four-wheel drive advertisements. I mean, that's the sort of cynical vision that we imagine our landscape as something that will, as the painter John Brack said, you know, most Australians are visitors to the bush.
Well, actually, that's probably not a bad thing. And I think to get the rapture effect that Ari and I think both enjoy whenever we go into the wilderness, you probably need to let people out there once in a while so they actually they experience why you want to save it. But you don't want to let them out there too often, or too many of them.
There's a question, right? I've spotted you also, but there's one right down the front. If you, we'll just have to wait for a moment while someone scurries with a microphone. But I have, and then we have another one waiting in the wings.
Seamus McManus, and I've found that the bush to be very, very religious, and so I'm best described these days as a bush Baptist. But I just am a little concerned. You spoke about the kettle on top of the soil, but in a lot of areas now, there's a lot of mining for water under the soil for sustaining populations. And I refer to a recent report from Western Australia where there's so many trees have been dying, and they were wondering why, and now they've found out. They've just done a little bit too much mining for water. So I just wondered if you had a comment on that, because it's not really evident, is it, until it's sort of too late?
Yes. That's a problem in a lot of cases. I mean, the groundwater resources are not that well understood. A total understanding of how surface water and groundwater resources interact isn't all that well understood. For a long time, one of the problems they had in Western Australia was increasing problems with dryland salinity, where cover had been removed, so when rains came, the water started pushing the salt layer up close to the surface. It hasn't been a problem so much in drought years. People stopped talking about it so much. But there are complex hydrological processes, and processes that involve how much of the land is covered by plants that gather the water and respire it to keep the ancient salt tables low. Those are all issues that have to be thought about in terms of trying to manage these areas.
I think if you're going to start extracting water for human population growth from the underground reservoirs, you've got to be very careful, because you really don't quite know what you're going to do, what's actually going to happen.
Yeah.
So.
And there's a question over here.
Jan Elder. I want to quibble about terminology, but I just like to suggest that the idea of landscape is very much a cultural concept, and landscapes of the imagination. And we're incorporating into this discussion Aboriginal paintings. And if we think about the popularity, say, of Namatjira's work, where does he sit there? He was painting landscapes, but was he... had he appropriated this white man's term and produced an image that he knew would appeal to white people. If we look at Emily's work, it's very different. And would we call it a landscape? Maybe we could make a contrast between landscape and place, if we think of place as where you live. And somehow maybe Namatjira had a notion of place and landscape that he brought together. It was a living image of the centre in the way that someone like Nolan was producing images of the dead centre. Just wonder if you might comment on some of those thoughts.
Sounds like one for Janine and Tim. Yeah.
I'll sort of leap in first and say that, I think they're very different generations, from Emily to Namatjira. And, it was interesting when Tim was talking and thinking back to my childhood and reading the Australian Women's Weekly and becoming Namatjira was so popular. I mean, you saw his images everywhere constantly. It was really very interesting. And of course, because he had trained in the way that he had with Rex Batterby, he had adopted a particular language, a Western language for representing the land. And maybe that was, there have also been a lot of problems recently for Aboriginal artists since the 70s, since Papunya, when the sort of contemporary Aboriginal movement took off, when Jeff Barden went out there and gave some of the people there Western art materials, and they began to tell their stories with those materials. And then there were often problems about what was secret and what was sacred, and stories that shouldn't be told, and men's stories that shouldn't be shown to women. I mean, it became a very complex issue, and a way Namatjira sort of got around all of that by representing his country in a Western manner. But the other thing about the current contemporary Aboriginal art movement is it uses Western art materials to tell traditional and mythic stories. I agree with you. I suppose my response to it is I think there are just these enormous schisms in the way that we, who's we anyway, understand the land and the landscape. I mean, for Aboriginal people, the land is sacred. It's sacred, it's real and it's alive and it's nurtured. And we can read about that, we can understand that, and in our own way we can probably experience it. Of course you can experience the land, the earth in that way, but it's much more specific. So I just feel that the contemporary movement, together with, say, Namatjira's, earlier, brilliant, exciting work in this, just shows that Aboriginal visual culture is constantly able to reinterpret itself, to represent itself, to re-engage with a wide audience. Because as I said at the beginning of my paper, there's no word for art. This idea of art and landscape, these terms we use, are not applicable to Aboriginal culture. So I would just like to leave it open rather than try to sum it up or close it. I hope I'm making some sense there. Tim?
Yeah, I'll just add a few things to what Janine said. When Namatjira begins sort of to become a celebrity, he both becomes enormously popular, and as many of you will know, his work is largely rejected by the kind of white art curatorial establishment, and it's rejected on the basis that what he's doing has no authenticity, that it's purely sort of derivative of people like Rex Batterby, that he's painting in watercolour, and he's just sort of learned to become another sort of Hyson-esque kind of Batterby-esque gumtree painter. And that is a very powerful view for a long time. And then beginning particularly with an essay which Daniel Thomas wrote, I guess, in the early 1980s, at an exhibition held in Alice Springs, there was a major revaluation of Namatjira's work, and people began to argue that far from kind of losing his Aboriginality in taking up this Western mode, that he had actually continued to paint his country and to find a way of painting what was sacred to him through this kind of watercolour mode. And then, more recently, when the Centenary exhibition happened, which Alison French did at the National Gallery of Australia, one of the things which she presented really powerfully was that the kind of image which many of you, including Chris, had grown up with of Namatjira with these placemats actually, was just a fraction of his art, and that in fact his art was actually, much more diverse and actually much more exciting visually than the coasters and the placemats. So it's kept on being, and it's continuing.
Now, there were 3 questions lined up, and I think they'll have to be our final 3 questions. And there was one there. I'm working on the honesty system too. And where was my third? There. So we'll go 1, 2, 3. I'm aware we've got another session scheduled. So if the 3 remaining questions could have a brief throw to the panel, and we'll hear you all out.
Just to throw something from left field into the discussion, to me, we've been talking about things that have far past from the current things that we're facing. Don't you think, or do you agree or disagree with me, that biodiversity in our times is all about how many humans we can keep alive on the earth in the natural or unnatural state of the world because of human development itself? Now, you've all been talking about a diversity that seems to be based on the preservation of nature that is not affected by humans. Isn't the real thing that we should be talking about and have to be talking about how we humans are likely to be making ourselves undiverse, i.e. we're not using our relationship to nature to keep ourselves going?
Ari?
I think one of the points I was trying to make, and obviously I didn't quite get it across, is that there is no such thing as a static landscape. I mean, biodiversity is changing all the time. And I think, we have a much greater appreciation for that. And we also have a much greater appreciation of the fact that human activities, even in their most indirect way, such as, for instance, introducing a pasture plant that becomes a weed, or through climate change, or other sorts of changes that are happening around us all the time, or phosphate fertilizer in soil and those sorts of things, is having an enormous impact on our biodiversity that we're only starting to really grasp the consequences of now. So we are sitting in a situation where we're starting to appreciate human impacts, but I think the other side of the coin is that we are also starting to appreciate what a huge impact biodiversity can have on humans. And it's, the example I gave was in relation to water storage in the Alps, but the very vegetation that we have in our natural landscapes has an enormous impact, for instance, on microclimates that is only now being appreciated. And once you remove that, of course, then you can actually change, for instance, local rainfall patterns to such an extent that agriculture in marginal lands can become very difficult. So I think there's a very fine balance between thinking about biodiversity, and I don't think we see it just as preserving a natural state, because we appreciate its dynamic. For good or for bad, it's actually dynamic. But we also appreciate that the connection between us staying alive and getting essential services and maintaining biodiversity are much more closely tied than we previously would have imagined 10 or 20 years ago.
So our penultimate question from up the back there.
I found the discussion of the possibilities for biodiversity in rural areas and in urban areas really interesting. Since we're an island and the coast is perhaps one place where urban areas do meet a wilderness of another sort, I wonder if you might say something about the role of coastal landscapes and seascapes in our national identity and the influence of that place, if there is any, in the way we treat biodiversity in those areas.
Well, I can comment on that a little bit. I mean, as another question raised, so much of Australia's population is concentrated right on the coast, and that's had a lot of implications for coastal biodiversity, particularly the strip that's sort of about, sort of 100 meters from the high water line is a really important area. And along the New South Wales coast, much of this has been threatened by a South African plant, bitu bush, that was introduced really to stabilize sand dunes after sand mining. And it's a major threatening process for the biodiversity in that strip. It's been targeted by a lot of people. So that, it is part of the national, obviously part of the national identity, about that we're on the beach and so forth, but a lot of the activities we take on the beach, the fact that people want to build houses on the beach and so forth, is a real issue. And I'd say, without having statistics at my fingertips, I'd say in general, because of invasive species, land clearing, development, and so forth, it's one of those most fragile and at-risk ecosystems in Australia.
I think the other point is just to go further offshore and to think about MPAs, marine protected areas, and the movement to establish them and to establish them in a substantial way is under real threat at the moment. There's been a real kind of kickback or against them, and I think that's just not getting anything like sufficient attention.
Now, our final question from the front row.
Many of you will have, I hope, seen the painting by von Gerard of Tower Hill in its newly clean state down at the Federation Square. Now, that's been taken as a model for restoring the vegetation. And some people argue about that. A geological colleague of mine said, well, the first vegetation would have been hot rocks and a wisp of smoke. When Tower Hill was formed as a volcano, we go back 38,000 years. And the interesting news is that at that stage, we were going through a very cold period, a very dry period, strong westerly winds, sand dunes moving over parts of Gippsland, and the vegetation was grassland. The trees had disappeared. The trees that we now have along the Yarra and the Werribee and the Narrabeen came back 13,000 years ago. Where they went to is a bit of a mystery. If we're going to see those sort of climate changes, which of course coincide with the Aboriginal presence in the landscape, what sort of biodiversity we're going to see if we are faced with perhaps not quite so fast or quite so long-term climate changes in the future?
Ari, wrap it up, my friend. 13,000 years, go for it.
I mean, I think what you say really reinforces the notion that landscapes can change quite rapidly, and we need to treat them as landscapes that are changing and not something that's static. But we also need to actually preserve the processes in the landscape that allow us to get through those periods where there are substantial changes happening. And you said, well, what happens to the trees? Well, obviously, what we need to be able to do is to say, well, these are the important refuge areas, and we need to preserve those refuge areas because that's where the trees might have to go. And I think that really reinforces a point that Rick was trying to make as well, that, you know, we have to ensure that we preserve things for the future, and that might mean that our best farming land might become our best refuge land, and we have to potentially take steps to ensure that land is available for some plants to go somewhere in case those massive changes start happening. You know, it's dynamic, unfortunately, it's not static.
If I might just bring it to, it seems to me that both Janine and Tim have suggested that in its own way, art is one of those refuge areas, if only in the imagination.
Well, I don't know if it's only in the imagination. I think that's a very good point. And I think for Aboriginal culture, art has certainly become a refuge area. I mean, it's become an area of regeneration as well. It's interesting when, you know, Emily's people took over Utopia again because that had been farmed. And it was only when they took that land back that the land began to revegetate, you know, after decades and decades and decades of you know, rabbits running everywhere and cattle running everywhere and cattle, you know, polluting the different kind of soakages where Aboriginal people used to live. So I think that word dynamic, which you were saying, is this a good thing, is it a bad thing? I mean, art is also dynamic too. And I think, you know, Aboriginal people have proved that they have an incredibly dynamic relationship with contemporary art because their work looks totally contemporary. You know, it looks abstract, it looks amazing, it looks powerful, and it's full of these wonderful, powerful symbols and stories. So it's kind of, yeah, I think it is a refuge, but it's also a kind of, it's more than that. It is very much a place of regeneration.
Thank you to all our four speakers. Bravo to Janine, what a great conclusion.